Amela, a spirited young woman from a modest background, meets Steve, a musician with big dreams, at a mutual friends gathering. The night was warm, carrying with it a slight breeze that hinted at the early arrival of spring. Amela, a young woman in her mid-twenties with a quiet grace about her, found herself at a small gathering thrown by a friend. She wasn't much of a social butterfly, but the invitation had been persistent, and a change of pace felt refreshing. She worked long hours at a bookstore, finding solace in the company of paperbacks and the scent of freshly printed pages. Her life was simple and she was content, at least she thought she was, until that evening. Amela had just poured herself a glass of wine when she noticed a guy sitting alone by the window, playing the guitar with a quiet intensity. He was slightly older than her, his features softened by a gentle expression. His fingers moved effortlessly over the strings, each note filling the room with a warmth that was as familiar as it was distant. There was something haunting in his playing, an unspoken sadness that drew her in. Steve was the type of person who moved through life like a storm had swept him up and left him somewhere new each day. He was a musician, a dreamer with a life as scattered as the tunes he played. And on that night he found himself at the same gathering, not by plan but by chance. A friend had dragged him there, hoping he'd loosen up a bit. As the evening progressed, Amela couldn't resist approaching him. She quietly sat nearby, listening as he played, her heart unexpectedly stirred by each chord. Eventually Steve looked up, noticing her for the first time, and offered a warm smile. "Do you like music?" he asked, his voice soft but resonant. "I love it," Amela replied, her eyes meeting his. "It feels like home somehow." They began talking, their conversation easy and unguarded, as though they'd known each other forever. Amela learned that Steve had a turbulent past. He'd grown up with very little, fighting to survive on his own from a young age. Music was the one thing that had given him purpose and hope, even on the darkest days. He spoke of his dream to someday make a real living with his music, to play in places he'd only ever seen on TV. And as they shared stories, laughing at their mutual quirks and confessing their fears, a spark flickered between them, growing brighter with each passing hour. The night slipped away, unnoticed by either of them, as they walked through empty streets until dawn, hand in hand, exchanging stories of hope and heartbreak under a sky that slowly turned from deep blue to light. In the days that followed, Amela and Steve became inseparable. Their connection ran deep, something beyond physical attraction. She felt alive with him in a way she'd never experienced before, and for the first time she allowed herself to dream beyond the boundaries of her quiet, familiar life. Steve too felt a change within him. Amela grounded him, gave him a sense of peace he'd never found on his own. They were two imperfect people who had somehow found solace in each other's presence, and together, they began to build a world of their own, small and fragile but filled with love. As the days turned into weeks, Amela and Steve fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. They spent countless hours together, finding comfort in the simplicity of each other's presence. They would often go for long walks through the city, stopping by small cafes to share a warm drink and listen to street musicians, Steve always listening closely, his fingers twitching along to the beat, as if he couldn't help but imagine himself playing beside them. On the weekends they'd take the bus to a nearby park. Amela would pack a modest picnic and they would spend the day talking, laughing, and sometimes just lying in silence, watching the clouds drift by. It was in these quiet moments that their connection felt most profound. Neither had to say a word. They understood each other in a way that words could never express. But as much as they cherished these moments, reality often intruded. Steve's passion for music had yet to translate into a stable career. He played in small bars, sometimes for nothing more than a meal or a handful of tips. Amela, too, was barely scraping by with her job at the bookstore. Her paycheck was modest, stretched thin across rent, groceries, and the few necessities she allowed herself. It wasn't long before they began to feel the strain of their financial struggles, yet they clung to each other, determined to make it work. One evening Steve came over with a small gift. It was a delicate silver necklace, simple but elegant, and it glinted in the dim light of her apartment. Amela's eyes widened as she took it in her hands, her heart swelling with gratitude and disbelief. "Steve, you didn't have to do this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know," he replied, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But I wanted you to have something beautiful. You deserve it." She held the necklace tightly, feeling both joy and sadness. She knew he had likely skipped meals or foregone other necessities to buy it for her, a sacrifice that weighed heavily on her heart. Their love was full of sacrifices, each one small but meaningful, building up into something they could hold on to when the days felt darkest. But with each passing month, the weight of their financial burdens grew heavier. Amela's family, who had always been protective of her, began to voice their concerns. Her mother, in particular, was wary of Steve, seeing only a man who couldn't provide the stability she wanted for her daughter. Each time Amela went to visit, the conversations grew tense, her parents subtly, or sometimes openly, criticizing her choices. "You're wasting your life with him," her mother would say, her tone hard but her eyes worried. "Love is important, yes, but it doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't put food on the table." Amela would nod quietly, torn between her love for Steve and the guilt that her family's disapproval weighed on her. She understood their concerns, but they didn't know Steve the way she did. They didn't see the kindness in his eyes, the way he would sit up with her for hours, comforting her on nights when her worries kept her awake. They didn't know how fiercely he loved her, even if he couldn't yet give her the life they wanted for her. Their financial situation grew more desperate. There were nights when they would sit at the table, counting every coin they had, trying to make it stretch until the end of the month. Meals became simpler, often little more than a piece of bread and a few vegetables, but they shared them with gratitude, savoring the moments together. Despite the hardships, their love only seemed to grow stronger. They held on to each other through the storm, finding warmth in shared laughter, stolen glances, and the simple act of holding hands. But deep down they both knew that they couldn't go on like this forever. They needed a change, a miracle even. One rainy evening, as they huddled together on the couch, Steve spoke of his dream to travel to Italy. He'd always wanted to go to see the birthplace of so many of his musical inspirations, to walk the streets where legends had once walked. But it was a dream that felt distant, a luxury they couldn't afford. "Maybe one day," Amela whispered, squeezing his hand. "Maybe we'll both go there together." He smiled, though his eyes held a hint of sadness. "Yeah. Maybe one day." Yet as they fell asleep that night, both of them knew that day was far from their reach. And though they tried to stay hopeful, a small, unspoken fear lingered between them, that their love might not be enough to hold them together through the growing storm. The days turned into a blur of repetitive routines and growing anxieties. As much as Amela and Steve tried to ignore the strain, reality closed in on them. Bills piled up, and every unexpected expense felt like a blow to their already fragile peace. Little things, like Steve's guitar strings snapping or a hole in Amela's only pair of decent shoes, became small crises that brought them both to the edge of their endurance. Their once bright apartment, filled with laughter and warmth, began to feel colder, weighed down by the silent tension between them. Steve's late nights at bars, playing for tips that barely covered the cost of his commute, left him exhausted and irritable. Amela, too, grew more withdrawn, feeling trapped between the demands of her family and her loyalty to Steve. She couldn't ignore her mother's words anymore. Each phone call ended with subtle but pointed reminders of what she could have if she chose better. The arguments started as small disagreements, about money, about plans, about the choices they'd made. But the bitterness grew quickly, festering beneath the surface, poisoning their once gentle love. One night, after a particularly hard day at work, Amela returned home to find Steve slumped on the couch, staring at the ceiling. He looked up at her, his eyes tired and defeated. "I don't know how much longer we can do this, Amela." The words hung in the air, sharp and stinging. She felt her chest tighten, her throat constricting with a mix of anger and hurt. "Are you saying you want to give up?" she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "No, I don't. I don't know how to fix this. I feel like I'm failing you. Like I'm failing us." Amela's heart broke at the vulnerability in his voice, but her own fears and frustrations bubbled over. "It's not just you, Steve. I'm here too, trying to make things work. But we're both barely holding on, and I don't know what else we can do." Steve looked away, his jaw clenched. They sat in silence, each struggling to find the words to soothe the wounds they'd both inflicted. But nothing came. The breaking point arrived a few weeks later when their landlord handed them an eviction notice. They'd been late on rent too many times, and despite their desperate attempts to negotiate, he was unmoved. They had 2 weeks to leave. Desperation gripped Amela. She felt the ground crumbling beneath her, her dreams of a future with Steve slipping through her fingers. In a last-ditch effort, she decided to visit her family, hoping they might offer some financial help. Swallowing her pride, she made the long journey home, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. When she arrived, her parents greeted her with guarded expressions. She hadn't been home in months, and she could sense their disapproval before she even stepped through the door. Her mother's gaze lingered on her clothes, noting the worn fabric, the tired look in her eyes. She felt stripped bare, as though every struggle was etched on her face for them to see. They sat her down in the living room, listening in silence as she explained their situation. She pleaded with them, her voice breaking, hoping they'd understand. But her father shook his head, his expression hardened. "Amela, we warned you about this. You chose a path we couldn't support, and now you're facing the consequences. We can't help you if you refuse to help yourself." Her mother's eyes softened, but she remained silent, her expression a mixture of pity and resignation. Amela's last shred of hope crumbled, and she left feeling emptier than ever. When she returned to the apartment, Steve was waiting for her, his face drawn and anxious. She didn't need to say a word. The look on her face told him everything. They clung to each other that night, wrapped in a silence heavy with despair. The next morning, Steve made a decision. He couldn't let Amela suffer any longer. He needed to find a way to provide for her, to give her the life she deserved. And so, he made a plan, to go to Italy to try his luck and see if he could find a way to make things work from afar. He knew it was a risk, but he saw no other way. Italy was known for its thriving music scene, and maybe, just maybe, he could find an opportunity that would turn their lives around. When he told Amela, her reaction was one of shock and disbelief. "You're leaving?" Tears filled her eyes as she struggled to process the thought of being without him. She wanted to believe in his plan, to trust that he'd return. But deep down she feared this was the end, that once he left, their fragile love would shatter, leaving her to pick up the pieces alone. In the days before his departure, they clung to each other, sharing every remaining moment as though it might be their last. They spent their nights wrapped in each other's arms, whispering promises of love and hope, trying to ignore the looming separation that hung over them. On the day Steve left, Amela walked him to the train station. They stood on the platform, their hands intertwined, their hearts heavy with the weight of goodbye. "I'll come back for you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I promise." She nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I'll be here waiting." As the train pulled away, Amela watched him disappear into the distance, feeling as though a piece of her heart had been torn away. She stood on the platform long after the train had gone, clutching the small silver necklace he'd given her, the last tangible reminder of the love they had shared. And with that they were separated, their lives diverging into paths neither could predict. The days that followed were filled with silence, emptiness, and a gnawing sense of loss. They tried to stay in touch, writing letters that took weeks to arrive, each one filled with words of love and longing. But as the months turned into years, the letters grew fewer, the distance between them widening until it felt insurmountable. Yet through it all, Amela held on to the hope that one day somehow Steve would return to her, that their love, no matter how battered, would find a way to endure. Days turned into months, and months blurred into years. Amela and Steve's lives moved forward, but not in the ways they had hoped or imagined. The letters they had once written so eagerly became sparse, filled with delayed updates and tentative words that failed to capture the raw pain and longing both of them felt. For Amela, life became a routine of endurance. Without Steve, the world felt muted, as though someone had drained the color from her days. She continued working at the bookstore, her job now more of a refuge than a passion. She poured herself into the work, taking on extra shifts and staying late to avoid returning to the empty apartment that echoed with memories of Steve. Each corner held a fragment of their life together, and some nights she would find herself sitting on the floor, clutching the silver necklace he had given her, letting the tears fall unchecked. Her family, though still present, remained distant. They had offered little comfort after her return, believing that she had chosen her path and now had to live with it. Amela was left to carry her heartbreak in silence, clinging to the fading hope that one day, Steve would return. In Italy, Steve faced a world far colder than he had imagined. The romantic visions he'd held of bustling streets filled with music and opportunity quickly crumbled as he encountered the harsh realities of trying to make a living in a foreign land. Every day was a struggle, a battle to survive in a city that seemed indifferent to his dreams. He played in bars and small clubs, his music barely earning him enough to get by. The loneliness weighed heavily on him, and in his darkest moments, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But thoughts of Amela, of the life they had dreamed of building together, kept him going. He held on to the promise he had made to her, vowing to find a way back no matter how long it took. The letters became his lifeline. Each one she sent was a balm to his aching heart, a reminder that, despite the distance, their love still existed. He would read them over and over, memorizing every word, holding on to them as though they were pieces of her spirit. But over time, even the letters grew scarce, their lives drifting further apart as they both grappled with the loneliness and sorrow that had become their reality. One evening, after a particularly grueling performance in a dimly lit bar, Steve sat alone nursing a drink. He was exhausted both physically and emotionally, the weight of his struggles pressing down on him. In that moment he allowed himself to wonder if he would ever truly find a way back to Amela. The thought gnawed at him, filling him with a deep sense of despair. But even as he wrestled with his doubts, a quiet determination stirred within him. He had left for her, to make a better life, to find a way to be the man she deserved. And he would not give up. He had to keep going, to keep fighting for her. Back in her hometown, Amela's life had settled into a quiet, somber rhythm. She rarely went out, her once bright spirit dulled by the years of longing and solitude. Friends had drifted away, unable to understand her unwillingness to move on. To them, Steve was a ghost, a man who had left her long ago, and they couldn't understand why she continued to wait. But for Amela, moving on felt impossible. Steve was not just a memory, he was a part of her soul, an indelible mark that no amount of time or distance could erase. She held on to their love even as the years passed because it was all she had left. It was the one thing that reminded her of who she was and who she could be if life had been kinder. And so they continued, two souls tethered by an invisible thread, living in the shadows of a love that refused to die. Each day they woke up and carried on, driven by the faint hope that somehow fate would bring them back together. Yet as the years wore on, that hope began to wane. The distance had taken its toll, and both Amela and Steve began to wonder if perhaps life had other plans for them, if perhaps their love was not meant to be. But love, they would soon learn, has a way of enduring, even through the longest and darkest of separations. Amela's life had become a collection of habits. Each morning she walked the same route to work, glancing at the same familiar shops and sidewalks, her thoughts often drifting to memories of Steve. As the years passed, she had tried to let go, to move on, but her heart resisted. It was as if he had left an unbreakable mark on her, a wound that had healed but never quite closed. One autumn afternoon, as she was rearranging books at the store, a familiar song began to play on the radio, a song Steve used to sing to her during their late nights together. She paused, her hand lingering over a stack of novels as memories washed over her. She hadn't heard from him in years, and while she still carried him in her heart, she had resigned herself to the fact that he might never return. Yet something stirred within her, a quiet whisper, a reminder of the dreams they had shared. She finished her shift, her mind haunted by thoughts of him, and walked home through streets filled with golden leaves. That night, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream of him, not as a distant memory but as a real possibility. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Steve's life had changed in ways he had never anticipated. After years of struggling, he had finally found a small break, a steady gig at a reputable club in Rome. His music, which had once been a source of solace, had now become his livelihood, bringing him a measure of stability he had longed for. He had made a life for himself in Italy, a life that, in many ways, was fulfilling. But there was one thing missing, and that emptiness haunted him each night as he played. One evening, as he was finishing his set, he spotted a young couple in the audience. They sat close, their heads leaning toward each other, their eyes filled with the same kind of love he had once shared with Amela. The sight struck him like lightning bolt, awakening memories he had tried to bury. Suddenly he could no longer deny it. His heart was still with her, and no amount of distance or time could change that. Driven by a fierce need to see her again, he made a decision. He would return if only to see her one last time, to know if their love could still hold, or if it was just a cherished memory of a dream that was no longer real. He spent the next few weeks saving every spare penny, preparing for the journey that he had once thought impossible. Back in her hometown, Amela's life continued as it always had, but her heart felt different, as if something were on the verge of shifting. Then one afternoon, as she was about to close the bookstore, a customer walked in. She looked up, her heart stopping as she saw a familiar face. The face she had held onto in her memory for so long. Steve stood in the doorway, looking older, wearier, but still unmistakably him. The world seemed to freeze around them as their eyes met, the years of separation dissolving in that single moment. She felt her heart race, her breath catching as he took a hesitant step toward her. "Amela," he whispered, his voice filled with a mix of joy and sorrow. She walked toward him, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his face, as if to make sure he was real. The warmth of his skin under her fingers brought tears to her eyes, and she let out a small, choked laugh, unable to believe that he was standing before her. "You came back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes filled with the same disbelief. "I couldn't stay away. I tried, but I couldn't forget you. Not a day went by when I didn't think of you." They stood in silence, their hearts too full for words. In that moment, all the years of hardship, loneliness, and longing melted away, leaving only the love that had survived it all. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if he were afraid she might disappear. They spent hours talking, sharing their stories, their struggles, and the wounds that time had left on them both. There was so much to say, so much pain to process, but they knew that somehow they would find a way to heal together. Their love, though scarred and weathered, had endured, and they were ready to rebuild the life they had once dreamed of. In the days that followed, they spent every moment together, exploring the city, sharing meals, and rediscovering each other. They both knew they could never erase the years they had lost, but they were grateful for this second chance, this rare gift that life had given them. One evening, as they sat by the river watching the sun set over the water, Steve took her hand in his gaze steady and sure. "I don't know what the future holds, Amela," he said softly, "but I do know that I want to spend it with you no matter what. I don't want to be apart from you ever again." She looked at him, her eyes filled with both love and sadness. "I feel the same way, Steve. But we've been through so much. What if things go wrong again?" He smiled, squeezing her hand. "Then we'll face it together. We've already been through the worst. I think we can handle anything as long as we have each other." In that moment they made a silent vow, a promise to cherish the love that had brought them back to each other, to hold on to it fiercely, no matter what challenges lay ahead. They knew that life wouldn't be easy, that their love would always carry the scars of their past, but they were willing to embrace it, to find beauty in the imperfection of their journey. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the river, Amela leaned her head on Steve's shoulder, feeling for the first time in years a sense of peace. She knew that they had finally come home, to each other, to the love that had survived the trials of time, distance, and loss. Amela and Steve's reunion was nothing like they had imagined. The years apart had left their scars, and no matter how much they wanted to erase the bitterness of their past, it was there, thick and suffocating, casting a shadow over everything they tried to rebuild. For Amela, the reunion was bittersweet. She had wanted this, dreamt of it every single day, but when it finally happened, she realized that the ache in her chest wasn't just longing, it was a warning. The past wasn't something that could be easily put behind them. It lived in the silence between their words, in the strained touches, in the weight of their unspoken fears. Steve felt it too. The hope that had driven him to cross an ocean was quickly replaced by a cold reality. They had changed in ways they could not reverse. The love they had shared once felt pure, uncomplicated, but now it seemed entangled with guilt, regret, and resentment. Every conversation about the past felt like a wound being reopened, and even the simplest gestures of affection felt forced, as though they were trying to revive something that had already died. "You really think we can just pick up where we left off?" Amela asked one evening, her voice strained with the weight of a question that had been building for months. They sat on the couch, the dim light of the living room casting shadows on their faces. Steve hesitated, looking at her with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "I don't know. But what else is there to do, Amela? I came back. I'm here. Isn't that enough?" "Enough for what?" she retorted, her voice tight. For us to pretend everything's okay? For us to act like the years of silence, of pain didn't happen? I don't know if I can just forget, Steve. I don't know if I can just move on from all that. Her words hung in the air between them, suffocating and raw. Steve stared at her as if seeing her for the first time in years. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm just asking for a chance. A chance to make things right. But Amela couldn't shake the bitterness that clung to her heart. How could she forgive him so easily after everything they had been through? How could she simply erase the wounds that had been carved so deeply into her soul? And yet, as much as she wanted to push him away, as much as she wanted to shield herself from the vulnerability of opening her heart again, she couldn't. He still loved him. But love was no longer enough. It had to be more than the broken promises, the pain of separation, the silence that had stretched on for years. The days that followed were filled with tension, their every word and action scrutinized, as though they were both afraid of making the wrong move. They tried to act like everything was fine. Steve played his music, Amela ran the bookstore. But there was always a distance between them, an invisible wall that neither of them knew how to break down. One night, after a particularly painful argument, Steve left the apartment to walk the streets. He couldn't stay in that space anymore, not when the air was thick with resentment. He wandered through the city, lost in his thoughts, until he ended up by the river, the same spot where they had shared so many quiet moments in the past. He sat down on the cold bench, staring at the dark water, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on him. Amela had never imagined it would be like this cold, this empty. She had hoped for a reunion full of passion and healing, but instead she felt like she was suffocating under the weight of everything they had lost. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that she didn't know how to fix what was broken, but she was too afraid of what that would mean. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. She opened it to find her mother standing there, her expression unreadable. Amela froze, unsure what to expect. "Mom," Amela began, but her voice trailed off as her mother stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "You need to talk to him," her mother said, her tone sharp as though she knew something Amela didn't. Amela stood there, stunned. "What do you mean? We've tried." "No, you haven't," her mother insisted. "You're both drowning in your past, refusing to face it. You need to forgive him, not just for his mistakes but for your own. You've let bitterness consume you, and you need to decide if you want to keep carrying it with you." Amela wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the truth of her mother's words struck her hard. She had been carrying the weight of her anger for so long that it had become a part of her, a shield that kept her from opening up again. The thought of letting go of that bitterness terrified her, but the longer she held on to it, the more it destroyed her. Steve returned hours later, his face drawn and weary. He didn't say anything, but Amela could see the same ache in his eyes that she felt in her chest. They were both lost, struggling to find their way back to the love they once shared, but neither of them knew how to move past the bitterness that had poisoned their hearts. "I don't know if we can do this, Steve," Amela whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can ever trust you the way I did before." He sat down beside her, his head in his hands. "I don't know either. I just know that I'm not ready to give up on us. But I understand if you can't do the same." They sat in silence, the weight of their unspoken words hanging between them like an insurmountable wall. The love was still there, but it was no longer enough to heal the wounds they had both carried for so long. The bitterness lingered, like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. As the days passed, Amela and Steve realized that their love, though deep, was now a fragile thing. They both wanted to move forward, but they didn't know how. They had been through too much, suffered too much, and maybe the damage was irreparable. But neither of them was ready to completely give up. Not yet. They had to find a way or they would lose each other forever.